All right, greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel back again, here today with Tyler Austin Harper, who has appeared in my world in recent times with a bang, and his writings, his essays have been quite significant conversation starters, I think, on the left. Your work has been really important in spotlighting either the crisis of higher education, the kind of interminable what you call the gamification of race within higher education is something that you write about. The book review that you did on white rural rage, and that whole saga has been like literally, I think you became the main character of Twitter for maybe a week as after that intervention, if that's fair to say. I mean, everyone has become the main character of Twitter if you've been on there long enough, and it's never pleasant. There's never
No, that
like
is true.
a good way to be the, even if it's like, you know what I mean? Because
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
such
No, there's not. It's 100% impossible. Yeah.
impossible. Yes, it's like a very, especially in the Elon Musk era of Twitter, right?
Yeah.
And so you teach you are at Bates College. You have a background in comp lit, comparative literature, and so like myself, you are kind of interesting. I like to think of you as somewhat of a kind of interdisciplinary, highly trained and highly educated, but also sort of autodidactic. And I mean autodidactic very precisely, because people define autodidact as like somebody that doesn't have formal training or education, but I'm actually referring to autodidact more as somebody willing to read widely out of their specialized field. And I feel that like that probably defines you in a lot of ways, given that you do. I mean, that is sort of what comp lit is also.
Yeah, absolutely. Land of misfit toys, they call it. Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. And you have an interest in psychoanalysis as well. And I understand that you're working on a book right now on race in America, which will be working with a kind of Lacanian framework of understanding race. I think that merits its own conversation in the future as a standalone, although Lacan, might come up for us. But I think this conversation is more of a sort of free-for-all conversation, just to get a feel for your work, and also I think to get a feel for how you diagnose this sort of political zeitgeist of our moment. A big theme I think that I see from your work emerging in kind of utero, or kind of in the backdrop of your work, is the sort of clash of ideologies, the clash between a kind of problematic liberalism that seems to have hit a brick wall in terms of its own coherence in many ways. By that I mean, like, this sort of problem of elitism that is generated often from private universities, and the paradoxes that form of thinking radicalism can inject into the culture, insofar as like this is actually speaking of like psychoanalysis, the really well-known American Freudian Philip Reef, who is sort of a classical liberal, right? But he's also the godfather of what I would consider the American cultural turn to psychoanalysis. Herbert Marcuse wrote Eros and Civilization when he was living with Philip Reef in like the 1950s. And Reef himself argued that in culture, the ruling class invents ideologies that become nonsensical or non-relatable to the masses. And so for him, elite ideologies, especially of the New Left and of the sexual revolution, were a problem precisely because they were sort of untethered from a democratic conception of radicalism, right? So like there's a certain strange recurring motif in, I think, American political life, and I want your take on this, whereby there is obviously a lot of noble and true, I don't want to question the validity of frameworks of thinking about power that emerge from the elite in our country. While at the same time, there's also a trajectory, or maybe a vector, or a sort of a tendency, right, of those ideologies to sort of be detethered from the masses.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
How do you see that,
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in, and you're right that I'm very much interested in the sort of clash of ideologies, but I think we're also in a time in which the ideologies we have are really disordered. I think, a lot of what I'm interested in is what seems to me a mismatch both within sort of the progressive left and the conservative right. And this doesn't hold in any neat way, but I think we can recognize it in broad strokes, which is that a certain segment of the center and the right have welded themselves to a neoliberal model of capitalism, onto which is lacquered this kind of traditionalism that comes out of Burke and Buckley and other kinds of folks, and that are really incompatible in ways plenty of people have pointed out, but that conservatives have never really wrestled with. I mean, the history of conservatism and the Anglo-American tradition. I mean, in the 19th and early 20th century, a lot of conservatives were anti-capitalists because they recognized that capitalism was a threat to traditional values, marketized things that shouldn't be marketized, and sort of, desacralized the sacred and so on. And so you have this tension on the sort of center and the right between a kind of traditionalism and then an economic model that's not very compatible with it. And then on the left, I think, you have something quite similar, actually, which is that you have this contradiction between folks who also on the one hand want to be kind of anti-capitalists, and but on the other hand have a really actually quite libertarian cultural ethos in which no limits, anything is fine, etc. And so I really do think we're very ideologically disordered. I mean, from my point of view, I teach in environmental studies, even though I'm a literary scholar. And I think to the extent that I have a project, what I'm interested sort of across most of what I do is the problem of limits, right? And I think in various ways on the left, we have, we're really comfortable with limits to capitalism, and we should be, right? But we're very uncomfortable with other sorts of limits, whether, limits to whatever gets called progress, limits to personal autonomy, limits to even just norms in the sense of limits. I think there is a kind of, deep hostility to even the idea of norms and judgment that pervades in just certain corners of the left, not all of it. But this problem of limits, right, I think is one we see on both sides. We see it on the right economically, no limits to the market. On the left, we see it kind of socially, and those sort of tensions and sort of fallout is what I think I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I feel like it is the problem of Marxism itself, in the sense of dialectics. And
Mhm.
I'm not invoking dialectics as some mystical
Yeah,
concept,
yeah.
although many times people feel that way when you use that term. But I'm actually trying to make it a little more accessible, in the sense of, like, what's the meaning of liberation? What's the
Mhm.
meaning to abolish, right? A social form, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, someone like Philip Reef in The Triumph of the Therapeutic was basically saying that the models of how the left thinks abolition, or
Mhm.
abolishing oppressive social forms, is itself theoretically flawed,
Yeah.
right? And it's flawed because it's trying to, it's too ultra in a certain
Mhm.
way. And he's no Leninist, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Lenin can speak of ultra left. He's nothing like that. No, he's coming at it from a different point of view, about the psychoanalytic fact of subjectivity,
Mhm.
right? Like, kind of why psychoanalysis and Marxism meet. I think it has everything to do with this question of protest, revolt, abolition, and the subjective dimension of that, right?
Mhm.
And the very meaning of a liberated society is the question, right? In the sense of, and that actually I think also connects to the first thing I mentioned about theory as a democratic force, if that's
Mhm.
the right word, in the sense that theory, if it becomes so focused on a theory of abolition,
Mhm.
and I don't mean abolition in a narrow sense, as in like the abolition tradition that we saw come out of the Floyd uprising.
Mhm.
I mean it more in an abstract theoretical sense. And that's actually what I think concerns us as intellectuals in a certain way, which is, how do we clarify and direct the construction of intellectual ideas about a liberated society? Like, we know that the working class undergoes immense strain, anxiety, that people are unhappy in our culture. If we felt that they weren't, and there was already a kind of, like the conservatives sort of do, there's already a kind of harmony within
Mhm.
contemporary capitalism. then we wouldn't really be on the left. So there's also a question, I think, in your work about the meaning of the left itself. And
Mhm.
that's actually a very interesting fact about American life, which is if you're on the left, one of the things you'll be faced with is the question of what is the left,
Yeah.
right? And I guess I wanted to ask you sort of where you fall on that, if it's possible. I know it's a very big question,
Mhm.
but perhaps you have thought about that, like is there, because we have these traditions of the past,
Mhm.
and we all always associate and categorize people, often in very narrow ways, as
Yeah.
like, oh, so and so is a new left oriented person, so and so is a class reductionist, so and so believes this and differentiates and categorizes themselves differently. While at the same time, the left has a foundation and a history in universalism. So it's almost like anathema to the left to overly categorize people, but nonetheless, it happens
Mhm.
all the time. And even I would say I've seen people attack you for publishing in The Atlantic because The Atlantic publishes people who are critical of the left. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
also a sense in which, well, one is not permitted to be critical of the left,
Yeah.
right? Or that somehow the left doesn't invite self-criticism. And for me, obviously, the left has to be founded on radical self-criticism, in good faith,
Mhm.
obviously. But how do you understand the left and the kind of the sort of ongoing struggle of, like defining the left? I suppose every generation is forced with the task of defining not only themselves, but also the left.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was a much, when I was a young person in my early 20s, for a while, I would have probably identified as a Maoist, and I no longer identify as a Maoist. But I think, one thing I think about a lot is the question of, what Mao talked about as primary versus secondary contradictions, right? And so, I think for me, and I prefer just relatively capacious definitions of the left. But for me, I think, the question is the primary contradiction class antagonism or some other antagonism, right? And I think folks on the left, or at least people who I would consider to be on the left, it doesn't mean that they're class reductionists, but it does mean that for them, class antagonism, right? Workers versus capitalists, who has money and who does not, is the primary contradiction. And that doesn't mean that that contradiction, doesn't intersect in really important ways with other what I would consider to be secondary contradictions that might be, related to the clash of identity or whatever. But that it is to say that that class piece is first, right? And I think there's a lot of what gets categorized as left in America today is progressivism. And I mean progressivism in the vernacular sense in which we use it today. I recognize that sort of progressivism has a longer and more complex history. But if we think about a lot of your sort of average sort of center left progressive, right? As Adolf Reed would be the first to point out, they're the kind of person that sees the primary contradiction as an identity based contradiction. And the class contradiction is secondary. And so if we could have a world in which, as I often joke, the correct percentage of blacks work at BlackRock, then that world is basically fine, right? Leaving those other kind of class antagonisms intact. And so for me, I think that's the primary question, right? And how I would distinguish what I would consider to be the proper left from some of these sort of progressive identity, versions of the
Yeah.
left that are not actually that concerned with capitalism, even as they, blather endlessly about racial capitalism, which they never really seem to define. But is what is your primary contradiction? Is it identity or is it class? And for me, it's definitely class, even as I recognize the importance of those other concerns too. So that's how I think about it, at least and that's a very broad definition, but I also think it's simple enough that I find it helpful.
No, it is helpful. I mean, I suppose one of the things that's interesting about our time is I really perceive our moment as one in a kind of that famous Gramsci quote of the morbid symptoms,
Mhm.
like you live in an interregnum where morbid symptoms appear.
Yeah, yeah.
And then in that interregnum, those morbid symptoms actually come from the past, and you sort of are reliving. And this is even related to Marx's theory of Bonapartism, right?
Mhm.
Which is this kind of repetition of the emergence of farcical, simulated structures of history from the past, and that
Mhm.
you, as a theorist, are sort of left to sort of interpret them. Like, where are we going, right? I think that has some merit. I also think that the post Floyd, the sort of moment we're in right now,
Mhm.
I see as representing a sort of end point of both left populism
Yeah.
from the Corbyn Sanders possibility,
Yep.
or left social democracy is probably more accurate. It's that wall. So we hit a wall there. I think we've also hit a wall in the uh, spontaneous uprisings that came out of what they call alter globalization, which
Mhm.
had a crescendo with Occupy and then a crescendo with the Floyd uprising. That's not to say that those two models, social democracy and spontaneous social uprisings, are over.
Mhm.
It's rather to say, I think that they have rendered their strategies or their limits of possibility. We see their limits very clearly now,
Yeah.
right? And in a certain sense, the Biden era is a kind of depoliticized era, right? And so you talk about class, right? Is one way to talk about class theoretically through
Mhm.
op-eds, through essays. It's another thing to talk about class when something like a working class movement is actually happening
Yeah.
and there's rhetorical antagonism happening with progressives and with liberals, then people divide in clear ideological ways. One of the challenges right now is that the Biden emergence, his success, is kind of a restorationist,
Mhm.
right? It's like a restorationist of the old conservative Obama social order,
Yep.
right? We now can see that the Obama social order is a conservative social order, right? We
Mhm.
can see that clearly. We can also clearly see the limitations of spontaneous social movements as well as the limitations of the Sanders movement. So we're in a very interesting place. You know what I mean? Where sort of theory does like you as an essayist, I think are in a very important place right now because we have a certain vision, certain clarity. I don't know if you see it that way, kind of.
I do, and I don't think it's just those of us in the sort of academics or in the chattering class. I think many folks across the political spectrum are keenly aware of the sort of contradictions, antagonisms, and hypocrisy of both of our parties. I mean, we are, I think, in an election season in which there is an unprecedented degree of dissatisfaction with both candidates, right, and with both parties, and with Congress, right? Like, no one thinks we're in a moment where things are working. And Americans have always complained about politics, and there have been ways in which politicians have always been unpopular. But I think it's really hard to overstate the sort of scope of dissatisfaction and the extent to which these hypocrisies and sort of symptoms of what seems to me to be a kind of flailing social order are really very much on the surface. I think it's interesting because it's not clear to me. Where we go from here. I mean, in the history of scientific revolutions, Kuhn talks about, basically that just, we have this image that, science moves forward because someone has a great idea and then their peers are convinced and then, science changes. But he says that's not what happens if you look at history. What happens is that the people who believe the old thing die and then you get like new people who fill the void. And I think we're kind of in a kind of sort of parallel moment here where, many of both our intellectual leaders, but also our political leaders are very old. We no longer really believe in what they have to say. I don't think we have a successor theory to pin the revolution to. That's not what I'm saying. But I think we're in this moment where these like sort of human biological forces, which is the reality of mortality and death, are going to force a reckoning real soon. Because it's not clear to me. You're right about Biden being restorationist, but it's not clear to me who the sort of people who can step into a non-restorationist model are, right? But I think we're going to have to find out for the simple reason of human death in the next couple of years, right? Whoever is elected, Trump is not going to a third term, and Biden is, I mean, who knows how much longer he has to live. And so we're going to have to, some warm human body is going to have to, be new and have new ideas and step into that particular void. But that's how it feels to me. I mean, I feel like we're in a kind of purgatorial moment where, as you pointed out, like the fissures in our social order and our ideological order are really clear, but there's not any light gleaming through yet. But I think something has to give for some of those sort of bare facts of human existence reasons. And I think hopefully in the next couple of years it'll be clear where we're headed.
Yeah, I mean there are electorally a lot of inbuilt barriers that I think the ruling class has established to the possible emergence, of a viable socialist party or
Hmm.
workers' party,
Of course, yeah.
which I think it must be noted, if our generation, right? I think I'm an old millennial, you are also a millennial.
Hmm.
If our generation were to take the step into the abyss of trying such a project, it would look a lot different than what the boomers did when they created third parties, right?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that I do think that ideologically our generation has a certain advantage for thinking about forms of socialist politics that would probably and very likely fulfill some of the old 20th century models of socialism in a more rigorous way,
Hmm.
as opposed to some of these more like the Green Party forms of
Yeah.
thinking. So, I mean, I feel that part of what's going on beneath the surface is a sort of yearning, especially given that the Sanders moment was merely a kind of taste of
Hmm.
what autonomy in a collective organizational form could be. It was just a small taste of that, and we saw what happened. I mean, we saw
Yeah.
the fear that reverberated within the ruling class, within the progressive cohort, and within the neoliberal bloc more generally.
Hmm.
That's actually why I think that the Sanders moment was very revelatory.
Hmm.
But we're not going to solve that on this stream. I kind of want to shift a little bit more to thinking some of these sort of theoretical ways of
Hmm.
getting at some of the problems that haunt us on the left in politics, and one of them is psychoanalysis. Now, so a lot of folks have a sort of thinking when it comes to thinkers like in the Freudian tradition
Hmm.
that there is a sort of built-in conservatism,
Hmm.
right, to Freudian thought, some of which is warranted, some of which is not warranted, precisely because if you study Freudian thought, you'll see that there's a very like nuanced perspective,
Yeah.
politically speaking, of interpreters, right? So I want to ask you sort of how you fall, like,
Hmm.
because I think I was looking on Twitter, we had this back and forth. I think you may have been involved. Somebody was saying, like, a thinker like Lacan is fundamentally conservative,
Hmm.
right? And I felt like that's kind of a misnomer of the meaning of not only Lacan, but of like a thinker,
Yeah.
in the sense that a thinker, if they truly make a paradigm shift, like you're talking about Kuhn paradigm
Hmm.
shift. So if you have a historical thinker, let's say, well, the truth is, and we know this in the modern period, that they create a political spectrum around their thought. There
Yeah.
are Hegelians of the right, there are Hegelians of the left, there are Lacanians of the right, Lacanians of the left. Not every thinker is like that, by the way. You see my point?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like Nietzsche. Nietzsche
Hmm.
has this, he has concocted a spectrum around him. So, what are you drawn to in psychoanalysis? And I suppose, how do you how do you interpret the politics of psychoanalysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, the reason I find psychoanalysis in the Freudian tradition fascinating is that we can see the reason it cultivates such a spectrum of politics around it is that I think we can see both like left and right in here in that kind of Freudian model. I mean, there is something fundamentally revolutionary about the idea of the unconscious and its disruptions, but there's also something fundamentally conservative and conserving about the unconscious. I mean, the lesson of Freud and his heirs is right that you can never escape the past in a certain way, that it marks you in the sort of social order in which you live indelibly. And that's a conservative idea, right? And I think where someone like Lacan in particular is really important, and important for the left, and folks like Reef absolutely are too. I'm also a big fan, but I think is the idea that you're not going to escape having a master, right? I mean, that was Lacan's famous rejoinder in 1968, right? That all you're looking for is a new master, and I think that's a challenge for the left that we have to reckon with. And I think it gets back to my point about so much of the ideological tension I see at this moment is just around a dispute about limits, about cultural limits, economic limits, environmental limits, and so on. And I think that's also one of the core questions of psychoanalysis, right? There is no ultimate flight from any limits whatsoever, right? You can abolish one social order, but you have to install another, and there a new master will appear. And I think I think reckoning with that is like I said, I think it's the key challenge for the left. And it's where I also see the value in somebody like Reef, who thinks a functioning society has to have what he called interdictions, or these prohibitions, right? A prohibition, thou shalt not, you can't, right? That's key to what it is to live in a society. And we can negotiate and think some limits are better than others, and some thou shalt nots are moral, and some are immoral, and we might exchange them, etc. But their basic necessity is kind of beyond question. And so that's where I come in with psychoanalysis. That's why I'm interested in it. And I was also a big fan of Alain Badiou, and I think this question is also central in his work. I mean, his early work, like in Theory of the Subject, which is in some ways his most Lacanian moment, but there he really seems to believe in the possibility that a social order can be eradicated and that a new one can be born, right? I mean, it's also worth noting that's when Badiou is in his sort of peak Maoist phase, so that kind of makes sense. But in his later work and Being an Event and After, right, he recognizes that there is some kernel that has to be both preserved but also pulled through, right? That you can't just abolish the past. There are always these traces of what came before that are going to inhere in what comes next. And I think that's a deeply psychoanalytic insight, or at least rather that it's the kind of insight that Badiou only has because he comes out of Lacan. So that question of limits, the attempt to get beyond our current masters, but also the necessity of installing new ones, and the fundamentally sort of conservative problem that lies in there is why I'm so interested in the Freudian tradition.
Yeah, no, it's really, really well said. I mean, I feel like that's the heart of my interest as well. And I think Reef is an interesting case study in his book on Freud, The Mind of the Moralist, insofar as, for him, and this is sort of a reading method here, because Reef is not a clear enemy of socialistic desire or the desire of the left for revolutionizing society. He's rather kind of like Adorno in his psychoanalytic reflections, trying to clarify the fact that subjectivity, when it is inducted into a social order in which superego interdictions have efficacy, where they work, right? Well, what that actually means is that overcoming those dependencies of authority and so on are more possible. That's a very sophisticated insight that someone like Wilhelm Reich, a left-wing Freudian, would reject. Because for Wilhelm Reich, the idea of the Oedipus complex itself was actually thought to completely wither away upon a utopian socialist realized society. And I feel like now, with the weight of history, we know that that's not actually how revolutions work. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm interested in the family as a structure, because the family is this like sunk, almost not unchanging, but certain structures of the family do remain intact even in the face of socialist revolutions.
Yeah.
And so that tells you something about how we formulate a theory of overcoming or abolishing a social form, right? And one of the things that has been interesting in the neoliberal period is a lot of work has been done about authority relations and how superego interdictions in the Reefian sense no longer work. And so it's not so much a question of overcoming limits. It's more of a question that something prior to that, which is that subjectivity has to invent limits for itself. And in so doing, it becomes very nebulous as to what you are revolting against. And that actually then feeds into the right-wing narrative on the left as a bunch of infantile people concerned with things that are totally undemocratic and detethered from reality in terms of how they think. So there's a certain, I mean, it's obviously a bad faith reading of the left, but there is certain truth to that,
Mhm.
right? And so, I guess, therefore, then the question is, okay, well, then how might the left deal with this fact without, and here's the key question where it becomes very tricky and problematic, without reinventing, as you say, a master, or
Mhm.
reinventing a form of traditionalism that would somehow ape the right?
Yeah.
Because the right's aware of that. The right is aware of the decline of the efficacy in interdictions, which, I mean, a perfect example is that the right will play the same playbook of the left when they are persecuted. They will become the biggest champions of DEI. It's
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
like they
yeah.
sound like progressives themselves.
They do, yeah, yeah.
Th- There's a certain stalemate, or a certain question about the problem of limits and about the problems of tradition. And you're
Mhm.
totally right. And I wonder what that means. Like, I mean, I know it's like something that like McIntyre
Mhm.
would say, well, we need to kind of subtract from bourgeois liberal institutions and focus on cultivating a new idea of the virtues, or so people have different proposals, right, for how to deal with this. And a lot of it becomes very much focused on a critique of liberalism,
Mhm.
right? And liberalism stands out as the kind of ideological, I guess you could say, ideological enemy, or the ideological force that keeps this system sort of intact in a certain way. And then you see a lot of folks that were former leftists reject the left, and so you have that whole dimension as well. But how do you think of, I guess, tradition in this context? You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? Like, does that make sense? How
It
do you think
does.
about that generally?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. A book I think a lot about is Anthony Giddens, who's a kind of third way sociologist and a sort of vulgar centrist in a bunch of ways. But he wrote a great book called Modernity and Self Identity, in which he pointed out that one of the key challenges of modernity is that nearly everything has become a choice in a way that is kind of existentially overwhelming for the modern subject. To put this in Lacanian terms, I mean, the way Lacan would have thought about it is as neurosis, right? Lacan says the structure of neurosis is essentially a question. And what he meant by that, right, was that a neurotic is somebody who experiences the world as a source of uncertainty, that wants to be told, who am I? What should I do? How should I behave? Right? The neurotic wants, what Lacan calls the big other to issue a demand. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Right? And I think that underlies a lot of things like anti-racism, for example, right? Where you have, good folks who are beset by guilt about, America's fraught racial past. They don't know what to do about it. The structures of racism seem immovable. So they want someone to issue a demand, right? Just tell me what to do. And then here comes along Ibram X. Kendi and anti-racism and says, well, if you do these things, it'll be fine. But I think that kind of neurosis is one of the symptoms of the decline of sort of traditionalism. And I don't mean decline in a way that, we should mourn the death of traditionalism, but rather just as a consequence, right? And so, Anthony Giddens' point was that when you no longer have these sort of traditionalist blueprints that tell you who to be, how to behave, who to marry, who to love, where to go to church, etc., every aspect of your life becomes a kind of choice. And not only does every aspect of your life become a choice, it becomes a choice with very high stakes, right? In the 19th century, if you were in an arranged marriage, you didn't have to see your partner as an extension of who you are as a person, right? Because you contextualize that as I live in this society with these people, and this is what my life is going to be like, or this is what my partner is going to be like. But in modernity, right, every element of your life is a reflection of who you are, right? Your partner is a reflection of yourself. Your job is a reflection of yourself, right? Your friends, your hobbies, we're all programmed to see these as extensions of ourselves. And they're all things we have to choose, right? And I think the burden of choice is one of the consequences of secularization, right? That choice is no longer, something we can exercise in these very circumscribed domains of life, but something that the smallest and the largest, elements of existence are all on us to figure out. And I think that's a problem, right? Like you can't. It's a really hard way to live. That was Anthony Giddens' point. He used, Heidegger and Freud to think about it as inducing anxiety, right? I think Lacan would see it in a very similar way. But I really do think, on the left, the task before us is how do we provide some of those answers in a way that doesn't just reproduce or mime or ape traditionalism, right? But that, decides on kind of a normative framework in which,
Yeah.
people can exist, and that to take some of these burdens away, right? Because,
Right.
yeah, and I think that's the challenge, right? And it's hard, and that's cultural work, and no one is going to come along and say, here are the new norms. We're going to do this
Right.
now, right? But I do think that's part of it, right? We have too many options. We feel like we are solely responsible for our personhood, and that we've been told, and this goes back to Reef, right? That the project of modernity is this, endless quest for self-improvement, right? Reef was already critical of this in the 50s and 60s. And so, that push to endlessly figure out who you are, make these choices, is a massive burden. And I think the cultural task for the left, right, rather than the sort of economic or other task, the cultural task is figuring out how to take away some of those burdens and install some norms and figure out what limits are good limits and what ones we're comfortable with.
No, I mean, I feel like Marxism gets a bad rap for being somehow intrinsically class reductionist when it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Marxist definition of class is about a social relation to the means of production, and therefore it's to be understood, right, as an analysis also that is bound up with Marxist theory of strategy for
Mm-hmm.
how to overcome capitalist social relations. And so what I've talked about a lot on my show, I don't know if how much you've listened to it,
Mm-hmm.
is that there's also in the Marxist theory of class a missing domain which people associate with Max Weber
Mm-hmm.
in the sphere of, like, let's say culture, values, etc. Like in reality,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of Marxists, they're not necessarily class reductionists, but I would call them class minimalists,
Mm-hmm.
right? Insofar as what you're talking about right now, which is like class qua self-actualization,
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to flirt with the neo-Weberian understanding of class in this framework, as well as the Bourdieuist
Mm-hmm.
understanding of class in this framework. And I think that we should, while understanding its limitations for the problem or the political question of political Marxism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is about a much more minimal approach to forging solidarity
Mm-hmm.
amongst the broad working class for the achievement of collective class interests. You
Yeah.
don't really need all of that. But at the same time, I think at an experiential level, one of the things that's really interested me, and I think you're interested in this as well, are the pressures of modern capitalism around careerism
Mm-hmm.
and demands imposed upon us for narcissistic self-actualization. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean narcissistic as a colloquial term.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of mean it more as a specialist term,
Mm-hmm.
because I do think that, like, say, Lash's definition of narcissism is so misunderstood,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So
criminally
misunderstood.
so.
Yeah, yeah, criminally so. And you see, part of the way that I would frame it here, and I want your take too, is like, yeah, the point that he's trying to make is that this libertarian demand that is imposed upon the consumer as well as on the worker
Mm-hmm.
for this unlimited, limitless self-realization paradigm that is all geared towards market realization,
Mm-hmm.
in which the market dominates all spheres of public life. One of the effects of that is the stunting of the process of primary and secondary narcissism, in which actually what he really means is that narcissism is stunted
Mm-hmm.
as a form of self-development in a
Yeah.
certain way. So it's kind of a developmentalist theory working with Otto Kernberg's theory of pathological narcissism as also kind of caught within primary narcissism. So it's actually not that these subjects have too much self-love.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's that these subjects have too much inner self-aggressivity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that everyone is, because you could take that approach and say, yeah, everyone is so happy with themselves. No, that's not what he's saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? He's not, you know what I mean?
At all.
Uh,
No. Yeah.
right. But then that is not necessarily a Marxist analysis of class, but that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it fulfills something different. maybe it fulfills something different for a subjective understanding of what we're going through and what we're submitted to. Does it have a political, strategic wherewithal? That's the question of Freudian Marxism, I
Yeah.
feel. Because the classical Marxist analysis of class may say, well, you don't really need all of that. And that's the classic point of like Marxist-Leninists.
Yeah.
I mean, often I get this, often. Why do you care so much about psychoanalysis? Well, I'm trying to articulate exactly why I do,
Yeah.
because you know, you see my point. It articulates this dimension of experience, and that then furthermore helps us unravel the problem of depoliticization,
Yeah.
the problem of what we call political affects, right? And then therefore you can then use psychoanalysis as a way to sort of gauge political activity, militancy, limits,
Yep.
authority, right, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know how you see it, and perhaps you want to pick up on the narcissism piece, but it is so true that we almost have this like two-tier economy, right, in which there's jobs out there
Mhm.
that don't call upon you to self-actualize.
Yeah.
And in a way, if you release the superego burden of self-actualization, you could think of like that being harmonious. This is part of the reason why I found that film so insidious.
Mhm.
What was the film? I forget the name of it, with uh the woman who works at the Amazon factory and lives out of her van. Do you remember that film that came
Oh,
out a
yeah,
few
yeah,
years
yeah.
ago?
Yep. Yeah, I forget the name, but yes.
Uh well, you see the danger of that film, right? Which was basically trying to romanticize the sector of the working class that are in jobs that are like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that actually it's a story of her discovering harmonious bliss by having totally normalized the economic exploitation involved with that way of life.
Totally, totally,
And I
totally.
could not think of something, and that's one interpretation, right? But I could not think of something more monstrous than that.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you think about that vis-a-vis? Because I know you're studying class, you're studying the
Mhm.
professional question, the
Mhm.
so-called PMC question. And this is my latest way of thinking about these dynamics of
Yeah.
what I call the paradigm of self-actualization and the
Mhm.
pressures that puts upon us. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, so two things. The first is that, I think what you were saying about careerism gets back to the question of neurosis, right? And what the desire for a demand, and the question I think we should ask is, where are we getting demands, right? Where are our demands clearest? And one of the few places in life where sort of the modern professional subject like you or I doesn't have to think or question or decide for themselves is in terms of a career, right? Oh, you're supposed to get the next best job. You're supposed to climb the ladder. You're supposed to go to this school. You're supposed to get your credentials, right? And you're supposed to, pursue ever more sort of luxurious lifestyles and consumer goods, et cetera, right? Like we have a clear demand being placed on us that's one area of life we actually don't have to do any of that kind of questioning that we have to do in seemingly all our other areas of life, right? And I think actually that's one of the core problems. I think the demands we're getting and the questions we're not asking are precisely where we should be asking questions and resisting demands. But in terms of the narcissism question and the PMC question as well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Everyone butchers Lasch. I find it really quite horrifying. And one of the things Lasch says in his follow-up to the culture of narcissism, the minimal self, is he says, because he writes that book, as you know, is kind of explaining further what he meant in the culture of narcissism, because he thought so many people kind of misunderstood it. And he says, another word for narcissism is survivalism. And that he's like, maybe I should have actually called it the culture of survivalism. Because to your point, these are, when we think of narcissistic, we think of people that are very self-satisfied. And his point was we're all very unself-satisfied. And that our turn inward is, twofold. One, because it's the only place where we feel like we have control in a society in which we have very little control. But it's also a response to these external pressures that feel unmovable, right? I mean, he was talking about the environmental crisis. A lot of the minimal self is about Cold War nuclear anxiety, right? The sense that we have no control over our country's military apparatus or even the fate of the planet, right? Our economic life feels outside of our control. And so thinking about narcissism and contemporary narcissism not as a moral failing, which, the David Brooks of the world want to talk about therapy culture, and they want to draw on Lash, but as this way to sort of morally harangue us for not for being snowflakes and not bucking up, and so on and so forth, and for being too self-absorbed. But that wasn't what Lash is saying at all. He was saying, this turn inward is a function of these deep seated structural external pressures that we're responding to. But to your point about like going beyond just the sort of minimal class and Marxism, I do think the PMC is really important. And I'm not especially interested. Jacobin just had an article that came out the other day, arguing the PMC is in a class. I can take that or leave that. People love to have that debate. And, I don't think that's the especially interesting one to have. But what I do think is critical about, understanding the PMC, whether or not you want to call it a class, at least is like an archetype that we can all kind of recognize, is what the Ehrenreich said in the late 70s, which is, and this is an overlooked point in their PMC essays, but that the function of the PMC is to mediate class antagonisms between the capitalists and the workers, right? And that one of the ways they do that increasingly is in moral terms, right? That they are the kind of moral and cultural agents of reproduction that help both kind of balm the contradictions, that the workers are confronted with, and that also help to morally legitimate the capitalists, right? And you can see that in something like, the movie you're just talking about, right? Where there's this, imagination that there is, if we just naturalize this deeply predatory, mode of economic life, that we can retreat in this sort of like other kind of, more morally pure and simplistic kind of inner life, right? And that kind of imagination, that's not a working class imagination. If you talk to working class people, that's not how they think about working at Amazon. That's the kind of cultural production that comes out of the PMC that, functions to produce exactly these kinds of, balms, right? To go back to Lacan, right? Lacan has the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, right? And Lacan says, particularly near the end of his work, when he has these encounters with formal mathematics, he says, the symbolic is true, it's filled with holes, right? Anytime you try to produce a social order or a symbolic system, it's going to have these internal contradictions. And the function of the imaginary in a certain way is to kind of plug those holes so they become harder to see. And that's how I understand the PMC in kind of both directions. And it's sort of capitalist facing direction, but it's also in its worker facing direction. In the capitalist facing direction, it's the PMC produces stuff like anti-racism, which allows us to imagine that Amazon can put Black Lives Matter on the top of its website, and suddenly that, Amazon is some agent for revolutionary social change. And then in the working class direction, it's capable of producing these kinds of romanticisms about the inner life, and that, the noble, good-hearted working class person, yes, might be, have this crappy job, but it allows them this other kind of freedom, etc. And again, these are both of those images. Neither of them are produced by the classes to which they're targeted. They're produced by the PMC. So I really do think, I really insist that I think the PMC is an important concept. I don't care if you want to call it a class or not. I think there are good debates to be had about that. But I think insisting that it's not a class obscures this really crucial. I think the PMC is one of the reasons capitalism hasn't had this sort of catastrophic crisis. Is it's really good at sort of morally mediating in both directions.
Yeah, that brings us back to Philip Reef's Freud, the Mind of the Moralist, insofar as one of the things Reef is trying to do there is, people don't understand this, but he's working in a Nietzschean valence, and he's arguing that Freud usurps Nietzsche as the pinnacle of bourgeois thought. And this is the idea of why the therapeutic is triumphant. The therapeutic has replaced religion. Okay. And Nietzsche was a philosopher for Reef who encapsulated and gave voice to the bourgeois class. Therefore, Nietzsche could be understood as almost like a harmonizer of bourgeois class, in which he alleviates or treats the contradictions of the class. Well, in the Nietzschean terms, and this is where Reef is actually a very sophisticated reader of Nietzsche, he understood that Nietzsche also was seeking to obliterate proletarian consciousness, and that's part of the reason why Nietzsche was triumphant. But Freud too, because remember, Reef says that if Freud and psychoanalysis is triumphant, one of the consequences of that has direct bearing on the understanding or the management of political antagonisms in social life. In other words, if every political conflict can be internalized and interpreted as being brought back to a primal schism that is a reflection of the paternal rivalries, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is like the theory of Oedipus in general. Well, Reef basically says revolution is solved. Psychoanalysis is therefore kind of implicitly anti-revolutionary. But that's good for Reef, because that's actually what Reef wants. And keep in mind, Reef wrote in his later years, what did he write about? The dereliction on the duty of the officer class.
Yeah.
What he doesn't call them the PMC he calls them the officer class. Yeah. That's fascinating. So therefore, you can see that the very notion of interdiction, morally mediate interdictions, Reef is making a class analysis in a liberal way, not a Marxist way, where he's saying, no, you intellectuals have a duty, for moral mediation, but you've failed, right? You've failed. And then what's the problem with your failure? The problem has direct bearing on the possibility of artistic and cultural production, which would then, in a vulgar way, or could be interpreted like some of these people say today, like, oh yeah, there's no great Shakespeare today, right? There's no AI is smarter than most artists, or some asinine thing like that. Yeah. But you see the point, which is this Nietzschean Freudian idea is basically an analysis of bourgeois class maintenance.
Yes, for sure.
Right? And Reef, therefore, could be read by Marxists as a warning, because you see, part of what's going on here, I think, also is that Marxism in the 20th century had a long-standing debate. You see it in the Bolsheviks, you see it in Maoism, about the distinction between proletarian revolution and bourgeois. There are bourgeois revolutions. Like, bourgeoisie as a class has internal antagonisms unto itself. Not every class conflict is cross-class. There are some moments in history where maybe most of the antagonisms will be within bourgeoisie. I actually would argue that perhaps one way to understand our present moment is the depoliticization of proletarian social life. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So most political activity that's actually happening today is probably best construed as internal to bourgeoisie. Now, there are working class people within that. But what I'm saying is that as an organized social force, the working class has been deprived or stripped of its agency to act on the historical scene. I don't know if you agree with that, but
I do.
Yeah. It's kind of a big if you do agree with that framework, that should leave you wondering a lot. Like, that should leave you questioning, okay, well, how could we reintroduce something like a collective proletarian agency?
Yeah,
that becomes the question of politics, in my view.
I totally agree with you. And I think an essay I think about a lot is by a conservative guy, Julius Krein, in the American Affairs around 2018 or 2019. I forget the title of the essay, but it's about the question of sort of class today and reckoning with why Bernie Sanders supporters were overwhelmingly drawn from the PMC. And what he kind of argued was that the dominant contradiction right now, or at least the contradiction that is producing the most sort of political agency, is between what he called basically the oligarchs and the PMC, or the oligarchs and the elite, right? The oligarchs defined as the 0.1% or whatever of folks who primarily earn their money from capital gains, right? And then the elite being the other 9.9% who are paid very well but earn their keep through labor, right? And he says if you look at the demands of the Sanders campaign, they were all archetypal PMC demands, right? Pay back my college loans, right? That is like a completely PMC demand, right? It is not the sort of college uneducated proletariat that is worrying about college loans, et cetera, right? And so he says, Sanders, and not that Sanders wasn't interested in working class politics, but if you look at this, like who gravitated to Sanders, it was a lot of those sort of downwardly mobile PMC college educated folks, right? And I think that's a really important point to reckon with, right? That I do think some of the most left-wing people you will talk to at this present moment are people in the sort of credentialed class, like the top 30, top 10%, right? And the question is precisely the question you're asking, right? Is how do we knit that together with a working class movement? And I think we're seeing some hopeful signs right now with what's going on with UAW and unionization around the country. And, you know, the way I think we're seeing a kind of coalition of both other parts of the left, but also, you know, the union side, right? The PMC and the union side. I mean, you can see that at something like, you know, the protests in New York, the university student protests, where folks from the UAW showed up, right, to some of those solidarity encampments. So, you know, but I do think we need to avoid romanticizing the working class in the sense of thinking that, you know, the working class is going to save us in some way. And I think we need to practically recognize that, again, a lot of the parts of the left that feel like they have agency, whether they're right or not is another question, but that feel like they have agency are the PMC in their contradictions with these oligarchs, you know? And so I totally agree with you. I think the question is, how do we seize on these opportunities for PMC working class solidarity? I think that's really important, because I think, you know, the task, as somebody who's firmly planted in the PMC, you know, a thing I think is the task for folks like you and I, and that I also, you know, see other folks who are in the PMC that are not on the left realizing, right? I know a lot of people that work in tech. Their jobs are so precarious. They're making tons of money, but they're worried about being fired constantly, right? And that's kind of a new development, right? We're seeing all of these swaths of what are good professional jobs increasingly casualized, become more precarious, even as they remain relatively high earning. I mean, that's part of Astra Taylor's point in a recent book, The Age of Insecurity, is like this sense of insecurity is kind of globalized among everyone except like the tippy top. And so I think that's something that can be seized upon, right? To build kind of coalitions, right? Our labor, whether we're doing very well for ourselves or not, is increasingly rendered very precarious by market forces and billionaires. And I think, you know, those are connections that we can use to build a broader coalition. But you know, easier said than done. But I do agree with you about, you know, where is the political agency right now, and the problem being, how do we expand it?
I think that's right. And I also want to say, just sort of like clarification, and I wonder if you agree, but a lot of folks have this question, right? It's like you look out on politics and you say, okay, well, what's the revolutionary class? This is like a question that repeats, right? And I think a lot of folks don't maybe connect that to what that meant historically. The argument historically, right, as I understand it, is that revolutionary class is the universal class. In other words, when you said a second ago that one of the inbuilt limitations of PMC demands is that they're a reflection of their own self-interest. What that means is that the PMC cannot be the stand as the universal class.
Mm-hmm.
So the first lesson from that is a humbling lesson. Like, actually, part of what it means to like exist on the left today is to like reinforce that message. Because I do think without a class analysis, a lot of PMC people would happily, unbeknownst to themselves, think that what is generated in the spontaneity of some revolt is somehow universal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But actually, no, I think the Marxist point, and this is the political Marxist point, this is different than the minimalist class analysis Marxist point, is that only the proletariat can generate the universal demands. And that therefore revolution has to have a proletarian hue or a proletarian center. That doesn't mean that we are class reductionists in some paranoid way. No, it means that to revolutionize capitalism, right, there has to be a recognition that the forms that persist in domination are born from class exploitation, and that, like it or not, that like there is a working class which is uniquely exploited. And I actually have been more comfortable, and I'll be curious, because I think you're writing on the PMC right now. I've been more comfortable lately referring to some forms of labor exploitation in our present as immiseration. In the sense that, you know, I think one of the points that Marx makes, and this is a claim that I would make after reading a lot of like the biography of Marx as a political actor, is that what concerned Marx about the working class was the unique form of immiseration that they experienced in capitalism, right? And I believe this goes back to the name of the movie is Nomadland.
Yeah, yeah.
This goes back to the insidious project of that particular understanding of the working class as romantic, because the problem is non-antagonistic. Well,
Yeah.
it introduces the thorny issue of suffering. So, like, my claim would be that, after, and a part of it's an empirical claim, but part of what part of what makes universal demands universal is that they would be reflective of that unique form of immiseration that's happening.
Mhm.
And so then I think at that point, if you submit to that point, then you get into debate also with liberals about things that then the race and class thing comes back. And
Yeah.
we then have a debate which can become very emotionally charged because we're actually talking about the true roots of immiseration
Yeah.
and how we remediate it, right? And and then universalism comes back as well, because I think a lot of liberals will have the idea that in reality, because of the pains of the history of chattel slavery in America, there is actually only one form of immiseration which is true,
Mhm.
which is universal.
Yeah.
And so at that point, now we're back introduced to your work on race, and I want to kind of bring that back in
Please.
here now, in our kind of closing time together. Obviously, it's such an emotionally charged debate that oftentimes nothing productive comes from it,
Yep.
if we're honest. Um, and you almost need like a conflict resolution degree to like have the conversation on the left, which actually I incidentally do have some expertise in that, by the way. But I do think it's necessary,
Yeah.
right? Because you can just see it just gets mired in almost intractable um, forms of resentment that become a stalemate. And now liberals today are kind of saying like, we know the metaphysics of resentment. They make
Mhm.
that claim in the book that you recently reviewed, which I'll invite you to talk about. And for me, my take on resentment, I write about this in my book on Nietzsche, who's a
Mhm.
great thinker of ressentiment. Philosophically and from a Marxist point of view, I am of the view that because immiseration is real, right?
Yeah.
Um, the complaints and the negative affects and the resentments that emerge from that, actually, part of our task as socialist intellectuals is to allow for those resentments to be given voice.
Yeah.
And what I see is a pernicious kind of repression on behalf of a lot of liberals and progressive liberals to actually manage that. This goes back to the PMC moralization. But actually, what you could see happen if we were permitted for that, you could see actually a glorious confluence and solidarity over productive resentments,
Yep.
which would be absolutely inclusive of race and absolutely inclusive of
Yeah.
economic. I'm not going to say class. That's
Yeah.
too abstract. Let's say of economic exploitation and of racial
Yeah.
uh, oppression and the history and so on. That would be what I would want to see. I don't know how you parse. I mean, I do know how you parse it, but perhaps you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think, I really think one of the biggest problems we face today is that the intersectionalists aren't actually intersectional, right? That, we have all these people playing lip service to intersectionalism, and they're not intersectional at all. What they mean by intersectionalism is a sort of cross faith and cross color and cross identity coalition in which everyone exists in a happy sort of neoliberal society in which exploitation is sort of appropriately meted out on a demographic percentage basis. But they're not intersectional in the sense of class, right? I mean, and you can see this, I think, I, like, you work in academia, a thing I point out, I will beat this drum till the skin falls off the drum head, is that nothing has gotten better since George Floyd. Literally nothing in academia has gotten better. And yet academia is more diverse than ever, right? Many elite universities have done a really great job, and I think it's important, diversifying their faculty, making it less white, bringing in more identity groups. That's great, and I'm not complaining about it. But that is separate from the point that the labor has not gotten any better In fact, it has gotten much worse, and it has gotten a lot more precarious, And one of the reasons is we're not thinking of the progressives and liberals who run, elite universities don't think in terms of class isn't part of that intersectionalism. It drops out totally, right? And so if, the correct percentage of adjuncts are Black and Hispanic and gay, then, we're off to the races and everything is fine. And so I really do think, as funny as it sounds for someone like me to say, I think we need to think more intersectionally and, find a way to think about, how we think about class. And part of that is reckoning with the fact that the history of both classism and racism has produced contradictions and produced conflicts and antagonisms between poor white folks and poor Black folks that are mediated by, again, the PMC and the professional class, right? And so, I think, one of the most crippling things I think that we have on the left is the decision that progressives have made, a decision that has is really easy to understand because of the ugly history of the West, right? Whether it's the Holocaust or chattel slavery. But the decision that in the hierarchy of moral evils, racism is the absolute worst possible evil that trumps all others, right? And so if you are multicultural, but you're the CEO of Disney and you exploit tons of people, you're still on a higher up the moral hierarchy than a Southern person who is racist and whose labor is exploited, right? And I think, to get to your reference about the sort of white rural rage book that I talked about, that is what's at the core of why I find books like this so troubling, is they prove, and it doesn't take much proof, that, poor working class white folks have more racial resentment than other kinds of groups. That is absolutely true. But there's a deep incuriosity about how that kind of resentment was produced, and what conditions, who helped facilitate it, right? And it's partly because of the history of pitting poor white folks and poor Black folks against each other in Appalachia and the American South, et cetera, right? And so, I really do think we need to, one of the reasons I insist that we have to think about class first is I think if we think through a class first lens, some of these other problems like racism and so on will certainly not dissolve, but will become ameliorated. But the reverse is not true, right? You can fix racism and still leave all of the class antagonisms and labor exploitation that we have perfectly intact, right? And so, that is kind of where I come down on this. I do think we need to think about, first and foremost as exploitation is the great moral evil in our society today, and that exploitation has a racial hue, and it intersects with all kinds of other identity categories, and that really matters. But again, to get back to my formerly Maoist point, I think what is the primary contradiction and what are the secondary contradictions? And I think too many of us have decided the primary contradiction is racism rather than classism and exploitation. And again, my bet is if we solve the latter, then the former will get better.
Yeah, that's all good, and I'm with you. I think to add to that, part of the view of the left, and here even elements of the radical left, is actually the view that in American society at any given time, we are on the cusp of a full authoritarian takeover by the right.
Yes.
And so what that actually permits, because you see, one of the things that I'm interested in is the possibility of repoliticization, right?
Mm-hmm.
The possibility of outlaw politicization, outlaw from the standpoint of hegemonic PMC ideology, which hegemonic PMC ideology puts limits and tries to, they try to input limits on the meaning of what is militant, on the meaning of what is radical. So I think part of what socialist education should be about is to create opportunities for outlaw forms of politicization,
Mm-hmm.
which could include aspects of healthy resentment
Mm-hmm.
born from economic exploitation, cross-racially. Imagine the power of what that could do.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
you see, part of it would be about the disruption of the norms of hegemonic PMC ideology. And that's actually what I think socialist politics could be about, is that sort of surprise upsurge. You kind of see it in some moments with the trucker revolts.
Yeah.
The problem with them is that the right can so easily codify it or classify it in culture war terms of class. So we also need to be very kind of careful not to allow the right to sort of seize working class resentments. I think they have in many ways. I think that the liberals are right about that.
Yes.
Where I think the liberals are kind of misleading us is precisely around this idea of the true origin of resentments. Yeah, and I'm totally with you. I mean, I do think when we say class first, I'm with you on that as well. I also have seen how a lot of like left-wing academics will respond to class first.
Yeah.
And that creates its own debate. Obviously, it's a very healthy debate to have. A lot of it produces anxiety as well, because they want to ask, well, what kind of theory of class are you working with? Right? Well, what exactly do you mean by class? Are you, and so there's, and I wonder what you would say to that, like how this kind of goes back to my point about Marxism, which I think relies on a very minimalist understanding of class. Like, in fact, for most Marxists, the working class has always been understood in the broadest possible conception in a certain way. And in a certain way, I do think that Marxism largely, although not exclusively, has a kind of fundamental view that capitalism is driven by a fundamental class conflict between bourgeoisie and proletariat. And I don't think that that's necessarily reductionist to say that, because, a lot of liberals will come back and kind of make fun of you saying, oh, well, am I part of bourgeois ideology? And, there's that whole thing, which is part of the reason why a lot of people don't say bourgeois ideology anymore.
Yeah.
But I wonder how you parse that, how you respond to people who, because, a lot of things that happen, like you see this with, say, like Damage Magazine.
Yep.
Or like Lee Phillips or Matt Huber or
Yeah.
Catherine Liu and these folks.
Yep.
They end up running a risk, let's say, of, while they are pushed away by the left, by large portions of the left for being class reductionists, they run a risk of reifying an understanding of the working class through a cultural warfare lens. They run a risk. So Marxism, I always see as keeping us more honest about class and not rendering an understanding of class as purely cultural conflict.
Yes.
How do you parse that out? I know it's a very delicate thing, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. And I think that's one of the reasons why the PMC debates are so fraught, is because we simultaneously want to think about, class in the sense of exploitation, right? I mean, that was sort of Eric Olin Wright's point, that his sort of fuzziness around the PMC was predicated on, well, it is the case that the proletariat is poor because the capitalists are rich. And you can't say that in the same exact way about the PMC, right? That technical kind of exploitation is much fuzzier. So I do think we suffer from, when we invoke class, as you're, I think, getting to, we sort of invoke it in sort of two registers that are kind of lacquered over top of each other, but that are nonetheless fundamentally distinct. One is that economic register, which turns on exploitation. And then the other is a cultural register, right? And you can see this when you think about the status of something like a graduate student worker, right? So when I was part of NYU's union, when I was a PhD student, and I would hear folks say, in ways that would sometimes frustrate me, that, well, there's no difference between me, and we're part of the UAW, an auto worker, because my salary is about the same. And it's like, well, that's like actually a pretty narrow understanding of what class is, right? There's this other really important, folks like Bourdieu would talk about, but this really important, cultural and social dimension to class too, that you have this different kind of status because you're a quote unquote knowledge worker, right? And that you are sort of a PMC aspirant. And so I think that you're absolutely right that there is a danger that you sometimes see from people who get called class reductionists, even though those are often the people I'm most sympathetic with, where it becomes very difficult to disentangle that economic dimension of class from the cultural dimension of class. And doing that work seems to me to be extremely important. I also think that that welding of economic class and cultural class makes it difficult to see that there's also a right PMC. There's like a right wing to the PMC, and we overlap overlook that all the time, because we just think of the PMC in these cultural terms, right? So, I mean, if you, there's a great book by Alvin Goldner called Intellectuals and the Rise of the New Class. And in that book, I actually just wrote partly about this for Jacobin, but in that book, he talks about the distinction within the new class, or the PMC, between what he calls the intelligentsia and the intellectuals. And he says the intelligentsia are basically like technical people, right? The scientists, engineers, now we would include them as people in tech. He's like, they're rational and they're amoral, and their job is to sort of plumb the bowels of technocracy. And then you have the intellectuals, and he says their work is in no small part moral, right? That these are people who they're like the kind of professoriate in the media, et cetera, and they reproduce moral culture, right? And so a thing I think we don't think a lot about, and the reason we don't think a lot about is because we do this thing you're mentioning, which is that like we don't do the sophisticated work of prising apart what we mean by class when we're talking about the economy, and what we mean by class when we talk about culture. A consequence of that is we don't see that split between what Goldner calls the technical intelligentsia, which is more right, and then the intellectuals, which is more left, right, and concerned with moral work. And I think that's one of the dominant problems today. I mean, if you look at the two last bastions of the PMC with any real power are the media and the professoriate. Those are both being proletarianized or on the decline, but they still have massive cultural power. And then big tech on the other side, right? Like we are in the civil libertarians and the Elon Musks of the world. Obviously Elon Musk isn't PMC, but like, big tech, the most people employed in tech are just like right PMC folks. And so, yeah, I really think thinking more sophisticatedly about sort of the economy culture piece is essential, because if you don't, you miss all of these ways in which there is a sort of right wing of the technocracy that we totally ignore, because we think about this stuff through purely cultural terms.
No, it's good. I mean, part of this I also feel, just as a student of 20th century socialist history in America, which I've been focusing on for the last few years, I actually feel, Tyler, and I don't know if you agree with this, that as PMC intellectuals, let's say, although it's kind of cringy to say that, but let's just use that phrase for now. The meaning of Marxism kind of is important in this space. And I say that because, like, if we understand Marxism not as some kind of academic fad or some kind of fetish for theory, but like as a practical engine, like if we believe Marxism is catalytic, or like, let's say, necessary for the development of a politics that would truly contest our system. Like, let's say, if we think Marxism has like the best answer on like the problem of power today, like let's say, like, which I think we both agree to. Part of what that then therefore means is that within the intellectual class, we are going to have debates about the mantle and who owns the mantle and who defines the meaning of Marxism. Some sense. That's actually part of the reason why I'm very drawn to Christopher Lasch and his own Marxism.
Yeah.
Because he wrote a dissertation on the meaning of Marxism for American liberals during 1917 Bolshevik uprising. And he actually is one of the finest students of the history of the American left. If you just read like his work outside of like his popular books. And so he's very erudite in that regard. And he never really leaves Marxism, but Marxists left him.
Yeah, I agree, by the way. Yeah, right? I don't think he left Marxism. I agree.
Yeah, that's a big debate. I think, we've been having this debate about the meaning of Lasch and so on and so forth. And actually, I've had this debate and discussion with his daughter as well, who's a great historian in her own right.
Oh, yeah. Her book, Race Experts, is incredible. It's one of the best books.
Isn't it interesting?
It's fabulous. Yeah, it's so good. Yeah.
It came out in like 2000, I think, but it's very ahead of its time.
Oh, yeah. And she totally gets, I mean, this is kind of my bugaboo, but she totally gets that all of, she's writing before anti-racism, et cetera. But like all of this is just new age bullshit. Like she talks about, corporate compliance, the rise of racism trade. Yeah.
Intellectual foundations.
Yeah, exactly. It's like all right out of the new age movement. She's awesome. But yeah, anyway.
So interesting, right? Yeah. Positive psychology and like all of this.
Encounter groups
But which is really interesting because from the standpoint of like the scientificity of like Kendi and the whole discourse of anti-racism, it's almost like stripped of scientific authority. Like that question of its scientific foundations is lost or like non-existent.
Yeah.
It's so syncretized.
Yeah. Yeah.
So its own authority and intellectual origins are very obscure. But to go back to the question, I suppose what I'm trying to ask or say is like, and I don't want to use this word, but I'm going to use it because you invoke Lacan, even though many people will be upset with me. The signifier of Marxism kind of
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it does. And the kind of because to me it's a question of like the big tent. I'm a big tent Marxist.
Yes. Me too.
I'm of the view, right? I'm of the view that, let's say, as we're spontaneously developing this idea of the intellectual PMC, all of their rivalries that we have day in and day out online mostly, but also in events and
Hmm.
book talks, things like that, podcasts, etc. A lot of solidarity actually is kind of required for that class to formulate a sort of vision for society in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
And that is also a moral task. Part of the question there is sort of generational, and honestly, it's a question of leadership in a
Yes.
certain way. And it's like, are you up for it? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
are you up for taking the mantle? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that actually brings us back to Philip Reef, because again, Reef is writing with bourgeois class consciousness, let's call it, right? He's saying like, look, the new left is taking things in this really pernicious direction. Can we recoil from that? So I feel like that's actually something that I was wanting to ask you, which is how you understand your own Marxism. I know
Mhm.
that you wrote and referenced an article I wrote and you called me a Marxist, which I was very happy about in the Atlantic. I have
Yeah.
no problem with that. But a lot of people on the left are not comfortable being as called Marxists, right?
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of folks say like, yeah, Marxism is kind of, I don't know about Marxism. How do you relate to Marxism yourself these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often joke that I'm a soft Marxist. My Marxism is soft in the sense that I'm not necessarily welded to a dictatorship of the proletariat and the revolutionary overthrow of everything. But I'm nonetheless a Marxist in that I think Marxism gives us the best explanation for ruling class ideology, how the ideas that govern our society are produced. And if one thing I do care about is like trying to make the case in public that a socialism is for normal people, right? And b like it's not some fringe thing. Like these are socialist values are values most of us share, right? But b it is that a Marxist explanation of society enables us to see not just to notice contradictions, but to explain why they happen, right? And I think we see this. There's a certain kind of figure on the right who is like maybe done with neoliberalism, and who says things that some of us on the left will sometimes agree with, right? But they just like point out contradictions, right? They'll just say, well, like, look, all these like Harvard says they love anti-racism and blah blah blah, but they're very like they're very rich. How is that? And Marxism gives us an explanation for the ways in which the ideas that come to dominate in society are actually almost invariably the ideas produced by the ruling class, right? And so it gives us an explanatory framework through which to think through some of these hypocrisies and contradictions that I think other modes of thinking just allow us to point at, and so that's why I'm welded to Marxism. I think it offers the best explanation of the tensions and crises of liberalism that we are living in the midst of right now, and that it doesn't just encourage us to like point at them and say like, isn't this so stupid? It explains how they're generated, right? And in fact, it shows that the contradictions are not a bug but a feature, right? Like it is not a bug that Harvard has a $50 billion endowment and is a champion of anti-racism. That's a feature. It's not a bug that Amazon and Jeff Bezos says Black Lives Matter, but then he's the richest man in the world. That is a feature, right? Like these ideas reinforce in some way because they naturalize, to your point, an economic system and convince us that it can be fair as long as like it's
Yeah,
rainbow colored. So anyway, that's where my
fascinating. So
Marxism
for
comes from.
you, so let me respond. So for you, Marxism is the most sophisticated ideological account of capitalist society.
Yes.
But what I noticed in what you said there, by the way, is that your construal, and correct me if I'm wrong, of like ideology and power is kind of different actually than, say, like the Zizekian theory of
Sure.
ideology,
Yeah.
which is very post-structuralist, which is very much based on these kind of impersonal ideas of commodity fetishism, and the way that we relate to commodities has this unconscious dimension, right?
Mhm.
No, 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 no. You're talking more kind of along the lines of how Marxists used to talk about
Yes.
ideology, which
Yeah.
I have a lot of sympathy with. The only thing I would say, so I'm glad you, I'm happy that that's correct, and I'm very much in support of that. I suppose I would want to have another dimension of Marxism, which is what I would call political Marxism, which
Mhm.
is how can Marxism be thought in the context
Yeah.
of the revitalization of proletarian politics in
Yep.
our time? That's actually where things will get more interesting. But let me say, that version of Marxism doesn't have to rely on some return to Stalin or return to
Of course.
dictatorship of proletariat. That's not necessarily true. I think it's just rather an honoring and a recognition that Marxism, since its inception in 1848 with the Communist Manifesto,
Mhm.
has remained the summit, the pinnacle of the guidepost of the achievement of socialist values and goals,
Yeah.
right? Marxism, and this is actually evidenced by the fact that in his time, Marx was a mentor to all of the most popular socialists
Mhm.
that actually existed in the 19th century, who were way more like numerically popular than him, but he was always their advisor in the background,
Mhm.
from like Bernstein to LaSalle, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Marx not only provides in Capital the best understanding of the inevitability of the failure of the capitalist system and its logics of value and production, but I think actually Marxism provides a political avenue for the achievement of socialism.
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't know if you agree with that.
I do. Yeah.
Yeah,
I do, and I mean, and this is one of the reasons. And I mean, I'm not an orthodox Marxist, very obviously. This is one of the reasons I'm wedded to the PMC being an important thing, not just to reduce down or up and try to dismiss. Because I do think, if you want to, you know, ask, okay, why have the contradictions of capital not produced a conflagration, right? Why have they not produced socialism? The answer is the PMC, right? The answer is that the PMC is one bit, like, they function to produce smoke screens that both delude the capitalists into thinking that they're moral, and then delude the workers into believing that the system in which we exist is moral, and that prevents them from seeing these kinds of contradictions, right? So I completely agree with you, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's not simply an ideological task to think about how the PMC works, but it's actually a political task. I mean, one of the reasons, a pushback I get a lot when I complain about the quote unquote wokeness of universities is like, well, who cares, right? Like, I mean, this is just like, yeah, sure, I think it is silly that, there's all this diversity training and this and that, but like, who cares? Like, just leave it alone. Does it really matter? You sound like a right-wing guy. It's like, yes, it does matter, actually, because it prevents, and I see it every day, and maybe you see it in academia too, it prevents a lot of people from seeing all the ways in which they're being actively exploited, right? Because there's this moral hue to what's going on. So I do think, the political piece, right? The political economy piece is, I think
right,
reckoning with the PMC is more than just, this sort of ideological or moral project. I think it's
right,
actually really crucial to like why it's so hard to organize.
right. And also, yeah, like what is to be done
Mhm.
about the crises
Mhm.
of capitalism? What is to be done in a practical sense? I think that's where Marx has a lot to offer. And I would also say that, like, let's say Tyler is victorious, and I want you to be victorious. One of the signs of your victory would be that the right PMC would begin to censor you, right?
Yes.
And so be wary of that, because historically that is what happens.
Totally.
I think that we have a kind of view on censorship which we blame the left for today.
Mhm.
Partially, that's unfair. I think in reality, the more consistent historical form of repression, actually, and censorship, has actually come from the right. That's an argument we could talk about later. But like, in other words, like, some of the sensorial stuff we're dealing with in today's time really needs a lot of contextualization to fully understand it.
Yes.
It's very, well, it's very peculiar. It's very unique.
Yeah. And incoherent often.
Often. Yeah,
Yeah.
often very incoherent. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's another conversation. But look, I want to bring this to a close, I guess, by asking you to tell us a little bit about your various research projects right now, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
No, I'd love to.
It seems like you're working on a lot of cool stuff. You have your book on race. Is your book on race also where your PMC theory stuff is coming, or is that a separate
Yes.
project
Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
combined?
100%. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm looking in that book on race. It's called Race Games, and I'm looking at both the college admissions process and also some processes in elite hiring, and thinking about sort of racial performativity and the rise of what I'm calling the multicultural managerial class. There's
Oh
a
wow.
great book, and I feel terrible. I'm going to forget the name of the historian, but that recently it came out this November, that tries to account for like the rise of the PMC over the 20th century. And
Mm,
one of the things she talks about is the moral de-skilling of the PMC, where she says, being, it's kind of almost like a McIntyre inflected argument. Like you used to have these professions like being a doctor or even being a scientist or a lawyer, that both conferred, but that also assumed a certain kind of moral outlook on the world, that assumed that you had a set of virtues that you were unique to that particular profession, that makes doctors doctors and lawyers lawyers, things like bedside manner or whatever. And that the process of professionalization is the process of removing those virtues as key parts of the profession and replacing them with other forms of like credentialing and evaluation, et cetera. Right. So
mm,
it's no longer, the bedside manner is no longer the question we ask, doctors, do they have good bedside manner? It's like, how are their patient evaluations? Right. But
mm,
anyway, one thing that I think we see and that I'm arguing is that there's been a moral reskilling of the PMC in the last 20 years, right? Where
mm.
the professional managerial class, as it has become more multicultural, right? And I mean, a thing I think that's worth noting is, the sort of not the beginning, but like the first real concentration of new class PMC discourse happens in the late 70s. That's also when the narcissism discourse is starting, and that's also when affirmative action starts, right? And so
Mm,
I think the 78 Backy decision. And so I think the last, and that's not exactly when it starts, but that's when it becomes, more part of the
yeah.
college process. And so anyway, I'm interested in this question of, as the PMC has become morally reskilled, I think it's, partly it's become because it's become multicultural. And so, I'm interested in the ways that in both elite hiring and also in college admissions, people are forced to both perform their sort of moral bona fides, but also perform identity in various kinds of ways, right? And so that's what I'm working on in the Norton
Yeah.
book. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, very quickly, like I know from firsthand experience like the kind of strange cultures on a micro level that these ecosystems kind of induce or
yeah,
produce. And they're really interesting because in a certain way, like they create new forms of alienation, and that alienation doesn't go well even for the elect.
yeah, yeah,
That's the
yeah.
key point, right?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. In fact, this is what I'm sure you will encounter this and write about it, of what they call the imposter syndrome, which
Hmm.
is paradigmatic, right, of this ecosystem. Insofar as, what's interesting about it from a psychoanalytic standpoint, the imposter, right,
Hmm.
is the idea that um, kind of goes to Phil Reef's point, with the absence of an interdiction,
Yeah,
with the absence of a super egoic logic that would cohere these ecosystems, it's not a shock that these imposter feelings proliferate.
yeah,
And also that these imposter feelings are not necessarily locatable to one experience. Like,
yeah,
I'm first gen and therefore I feel like an imposter. No, I've seen the imposter thing happen like in very peculiar ways,
yeah.
like with people from all different backgrounds
Yes.
feeling this way, which indicates to me that it's like a structural effect of this new environment,
Yep.
right? Of this habitus that's formed. So that would be an interesting question for me, and that's part of the reason why I like doing podcasts, is a relief from the repressive habitus of those worlds.
Yeah.
Because one of the problems of that repressive habitus, right, is that they actually cripple thought in a certain way, and it's not necessarily their fault.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's not the individual's fault. It's like
yeah. Of course.
something is produced, right?
Yep.
In which you're forced into this.
Yep.
And there's like it's kind of tragic, right? Because it's like, oh my God, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line, and here we are thinking, but the conditions of our thinking are kind of strained or
Yes.
constrained. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's like the reality of elite higher education today.
Yes.
And that's actually, I would even say, Tyler, as a final point, I would even say, like, if you know elite education, I only know it a little bit,
Mhm.
very little bit. Those dynamics lead to a certain politicization of people.
Yes.
Like the politicization of campuses is a result of these contradictions.
100%. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think that's totally it. I mean, that's exactly what I'm interested in the book. I mean, one of the claims I'm making is that, I'm interested in the way that, people in the hiring process and admissions have to perform identity in certain ways. But one of the points I'm making is that this used to be just among minorities. Like, I mean, code switching, racial burlesque, like, passing, like these have a really long history. But what's new is that they've been universalized, right? So it is not just the black kid in the college admissions essay that is talking about their identity. Now it's the white kid. And that identity might be, I'm neurodivergent. It might be, my father was an alcoholic. And yes, I'm very wealthy and white, but look at this like particular kind of trauma I have as a result, right? So like everyone is compelled to put their best identity forward, right? And it's not just folks of color. And I think that's a structural piece, right? I think you're absolutely right about the structural conditions, but you're also right about like what we're seeing on college campuses is deeply connected to that.
Well,
I
it's like a model of a microcosm of like how people are politicized, or it has direct bearing on how young people construe of their own consciousness. Like
yeah,
I was saying,
absolutely.
it's like it's like a kind of primitive or kind of unrefined class consciousness. And I feel like as
Yeah.
Marxists, we should have the kind of dignity to recognize the kernel of like a rational element within it
Yes.
that
That's a
is
great way to put it.
actually like noble, or that could be perhaps steered differently.
Yes.
Because I think there's a tendency, again, and I don't want to like bash like Damage Magazine or those people, but
Yeah.
there is a tendency, right, to like reject it entirely.
Yes.
Where I feel like I like your work because you're much more nuanced,
Oh, thank you.
like you're gonna see some aspects that are actually like sound, or maybe even pre-emancipatory, maybe, or something.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, that's why I like Lash, because like Lash isn't dunking on the narcissists. He's saying like this is a response. You're right. It's like a primitive class consciousness or a primitive consciousness of antagonism, where like this is a response to real problems that they're recognizing and then like treating through the inner retreat.
Right.
No, I totally agree. I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, anyways, just want to thank you for coming on. This was the first
Oh, it's
time
been
that we
fun.
had a chance to meet, and I already knew that I felt like I knew you just by watching and seeing this. I'm very happy that this went so well, and I really enjoyed it, and
It was super fun.
really excited to see your work as it progresses and blossoms. And I hope that you're not censored. I didn't mean that like
No.
I was just
No,
saying, like,
you're right though. You gotta keep an eye on the right wing PMC.
you gotta be careful. And yeah, best of luck with
Thank
everything
you.
you're doing. I hope you have a great summer. I hope it's productive.
You too.
Let's try to stay in touch
Yeah.
and do this again.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thanks for having me on, man.
All right, cool.